Our story begins in the unexplored northern region of South Korea. A young man glanced around nervously when an elderly man approached him, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. The old man asked if this was the young man's first expedition. Accepting the coffee, the young man admitted that while he had ventured into gates and dungeons before, this was his first time in an uncharted area, which made him uneasy. The old man chuckled and advised him to brace himself mentally. Such places, untouched for centuries, were likely teeming with monsters, perhaps even ancient ones. Curious, the young man inquired if their expedition leader was truly from the renowned Lee clan, rumored to be the patriarch's brother and thus exceptionally powerful. The old man glanced to the side and revealed that their leader was, in fact, an illegitimate son of the clan, a man so weak he had been exiled. He was speaking of Lee Cheol, the 9th illegitimate child of the esteemed Marshal Lee clan. Cheol overheard the old man's words, telling the newcomer that he lacked both talent and tenacity, being only a 7th-rank martial artist at his age. The old man questioned how they could rely on someone like Cheol, causing him to grip his sword tightly in shame. Just then, someone approached Cheol and brusquely ordered him to prepare to move. Cheol glared at the man briefly before lowering his gaze and complying. He was aware that the men around him belonged to the Shadow Sword Squad, a direct unit under the Lee clan patriarch, tasked with his protection. Yet, something felt off. Cheol couldn't shake the uneasy feeling about this mission. There was a time when Cheol had dreams and aspirations. When he first understood the weight of being part of the esteemed Lee clan, he had been filled with hope. During the steel selection ritual, he had been chosen by the highest-ranked weapon, a moment he believed would mark the beginning of his rise. He thought that with hard work and recognition, he might one day earn the respect of his peers. But that hope faded. One day, a healer revealed Cheol's X-ray results, showing mana paths entirely unsuited for magic or martial arts. The priest declared that reaching the 9th rank would be nothing short of a miracle. When word spread, Cheol's achievements at the ritual were dismissed as a fluke. Despite this, Cheol persevered, defying expectations by reaching the 7th rank by age 25. For a brief moment, he felt genuine pride, even if his siblings had achieved the same rank much earlier. But his joy was short-lived. By 30, he was cast out of the clan. If not for his eldest brother's intervention, Cheol might have left the household in a coffin. For 10 years, he had been on the run, living in obscurity. During this time, chaos spread across the land. Unexplored regions expanded and monster invasions grew more frequent. One day, a newspaper landed on his face. As he picked it up, he was stunned to read that his father, the pinnacle of martial arts and patriarch of the Lee clan, had passed away. Soon after, members of the Shadow Sword Squad found him. When he asked how they had tracked him down, they ignored his question and handed him a decree. Cheol sighed, wondering if his cursed bloodline would ever release its grip on him. The decree ordered him to investigate the B1 zone of the unexplored regions and join an expedition team by 1830 that day. It was signed by Patriarch Lee Gunseong, his 3rd brother. Cheol couldn't help but wonder what had become of his eldest brother. The Shadow Squad members turned to leave, informing Cheol they would see him at the designated location. He stopped them and asked what had happened to the eldest member of the family. The Shadow members remained silent, refusing to answer. Realizing they wouldn't respond, Cheol questioned the purpose of ordering him to investigate the unexplored region when he hadn't wielded a sword in 10 years and was only a 7th-rank martial artist. One of the men coldly asked if he intended to refuse the orders. Knowing that refusal without justification meant certain death, Cheol reluctantly agreed to comply. Upon hearing his answer, the Shadow Squad vanished in an instant, leaving him cursing in anger, fully aware he had no choice. Back in the present, the expedition team ventured deeper into the unexplored region. The young man was startled to see an abandoned building ahead and wondered why it stood there of all places. As they approached, they noticed the structure was remarkably well preserved. The Shadow Squad ordered everyone to enter, and the group cautiously stepped inside, swords drawn. A collective gasp escaped them as they discovered a massive monster's bones and a pile of human remains. The team speculated whether they had stumbled upon the corpse of an ancient monster. Suddenly, the Shadow Squad captain declared they had found what they were looking for and ordered his men to begin. Without warning, the Shadow members lunged forward, slashing the young man's head first. Cheol and the old man stood frozen in shock. The old man shouted, demanding to know what they were doing. One of the Shadow members coldly replied that they had all been doomed from the start. He then charged at the terrified old man, yelling that they should consider it an honor to serve the clan's greater good. Just as the man was about to strike, Cheol intervened, stabbing him from behind and demanding to know who was behind this betrayal. The Shadow member, unfazed, revealed that the orders had come from the Liege himself. He gripped the sword piercing his body and explained that their mission was to bring everyone here and eliminate them as cleanly as possible. With a single hand, he shattered the sword, his wounds healing almost instantly. The old man swung his sword at the man in desperation, but the Shadow member effortlessly countered, slashing him with a single strike. He sneered at Cheol, calling him pathetic, before rushing at him and delivering a brutal kick to his chest. Blood spurted from Cheol's mouth as the man shouted that he had expected more from someone with the blood of the esteemed Lee clan. Keel was thrown back with tremendous force, slamming into a wall and coughing up more blood. Gritting his teeth, he refused to accept death like this. Scanning his surroundings, he spotted a sword embedded in the monster's bone. He knew it had to be a powerful weapon, one capable of slaying a great beast. Even if it had been there for years, it might still be usable. Summoning his strength, he grabbed the sword and pulled it free. But to his shock, the blade began to dissolve into the air. Before he could process what was happening, the shadow member appeared behind him, mocking that he had never imagined someone from the Lee clan could be so utterly pathetic. With a brutal slash, the man cut Keel deeply from behind, shouting that he would send him off like a Lee, at the very least. Keel collapsed to the ground, blood pouring from his back. As his vision blurred, he thought bitterly about the cruelty of the heavens. He had spent his entire life struggling, running, and failing, only to meet such an ignoble end. Unbeknownst to him, the dissolving sword released a dark energy that began to wrap around him. In his final moments, he wished for another chance at life, vowing to change everything if given the opportunity. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice. His father's. Lee Taishin, the patriarch of the esteemed Lee clan, was asking if this child was Yoojung's and what had happened to her. Keel slowly opened his eyes to see the butler, Choi, replying that Yoojung had already passed when they found her. Keel's gaze shifted to his father, who looked remarkably young, as did the butler. He tried to call out to them, but no sound came. Then, he noticed a baby's hands in front of him. When he moved his own hand, the baby's hands mirrored the motion. It dawned on him. He was in the body of a baby. This was no mere dream. He had been given a second chance. Keel waved his hands in shock, trying to make sense of what had happened. He knew he should be dead, but now he found himself in what seemed like the past. Was this the afterlife, a flashback, or something else entirely? Taishin, his father, instructed Choi to assign Keel a handmaid and a few Shadow Sword Squad members as guards, just like the other children. Taishin also ordered Choi to have Keel participate in the upcoming steel selection ritual alongside the 8 other children. Choi hesitated, reminding Taishin that Keel was still very young and not yet ready, and that the youngest of the 8 children was still a few months older. Taishin dismissed the concern, stating that age shouldn't matter, which surprised Choi. After giving his orders, Taishin left the room, leaving Choi to sigh in relief. Keel, still processing everything, felt the overwhelming pressure his father exuded, just as he remembered. He looked down at his tiny hands, realizing this was too vivid to be a mere flashback. He recalled Taishin and Choi's conversation, confirming that this had indeed happened before. Yet he struggled to accept the possibility that he had truly regressed to the past. A few months after Keel's return to the past, the esteemed Lee clan's special day arrived. The Steel Selection Ritual. This event was a significant tradition where the clan's children displayed their talents by being chosen by weapons. Taishin, who had been selected by dozens of blades in his youth, had become the greatest swordsman of his generation. Keel's eldest brother, chosen by swords, tomes, and staff, was renowned for his mastery of both magic and swordsmanship. Keel knew that this time, he would be the one participating. His handmaid, Moongawa, praised him for dressing so well, and remarked how well he was adapting to his new environment without crying. She carried him in her arms, assuring him that he would achieve a good result, and that she believed in his bright future. Her words brought a smile to his face as he remembered how Gawa had been like a mother to him in his past life. Sadly, she had been expelled due to the hatred of his other brothers. Gawa had been the one person who cried over his loneliness and stayed by his side. Touching her face gently, Keel swore to himself that he would not let her be cast out again and would protect her at all costs. He hugged her softly, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. A servant entered the room to report that the preparations were complete. Gawa asked if they should depart, and Keel nodded with a smile. Meanwhile, in the Patriarch's office, Choi reported to Taishin that the ritual preparations were finished. Taishin acknowledged the report and instructed Choi to accompany him to the event. Taishin then made his way to the stage, accompanied by his 2 children and servants. As they entered, the crowd erupted in cheers. The audience's attention was particularly drawn to the illegitimate son who had been brought in from outside. In the audience sat the esteemed Lee clan matriarch, Baek Hwayeon, along with Minister Lee Tae-hong, the first child of the Lee clan, Lee Myung-jung, and the third child, Lee Gun-seong. Tae-hong commented on Cheol's young age, and Myung-jung noted that none of them had participated in the ritual at such an early age. Myung-jung asked Gun-seong if he remembered correctly, to which Gun-seong simply replied yes, adding that he had no idea where Cheol had come from. The exchange left Gun-seong intrigued. Taishin announced the beginning of the steel selection ritual. He ordered a maid to bring his 8th child, Lee Hwa, onto the stage. The maid complied, and Taishin placed Hwa on the ritual stone. He then took out a knife, gently slashed one of Hwa's fingers, and let her blood drip onto the stone. Hwa cried out in pain as the stone emitted a bright light. The light floated toward the stage where the weapons were displayed and wrapped around the ivory sword, a relic rank weapon of utmost prestige that had not responded to anyone for generations. Taishin used his power to lift the sword and bring it closer, where it landed perfectly in his hand. He declared that from that day forward, the ivory sword belonged to Hwa. The elders congratulated little Hwa, expressing their joy at the birth of another talented child in the family. Hwayeon thanked them, though her happy expression faltered as the ceremony continued, knowing that Cheol's turn was next. Taishin announced that it was Cheol's turn, prompting whispers among the crowd. Many questioned how an illegitimate child from outside the clan could be allowed to participate in such a sacred ritual. Gawa handed Cheol to Taishin, who placed him on the ritual stone. Taishin sliced Cheol's finger, but unlike Hwa, Cheol endured the pain without crying. Taishin patted his head, expressing pride in his resilience. Cheol realized the moment had come. He remembered that in his past life he had been chosen by the Clear Echo, a heaven-rank sword. As his blood dripped onto the stone, a bright light emerged. Cheol stared at it, wondering if, in this life, he would once again be chosen by a heaven-rank sword. A few minutes earlier, Taehong had noticed Hwayeon's reaction and deduced from her expression that she was in a rather foul mood. He guessed it was only natural, given the sudden appearance of Taishin's hidden son, Cheol. Taehong knew that a pitiful fate likely awaited Cheol, as surviving as an illegitimate son in the Lee clan would be no easy feat. As Taehong pondered this, he noticed someone approaching. It was the head elder of the Lee clan, Lee Cheoljung, a purist and close-minded old man. Taehong expected a sarcastic remark from him. Cheoljung commented that Taehong seemed unusually interested in the illegitimate child, prompting Taehong to greet him cautiously, aware that he needed to stay alert around the unpredictable elder. Cheoljung asked if Cheol was the child the patriarch had brought in, to which Taehong confirmed, explaining that the Shadow Sword Squad had discovered and brought him in. Cheoljung expressed his confusion over the patriarch's decision, questioning why a bastard child of unknown origin was allowed to participate in the steel selection ritual. He pointedly reminded Taehong that the ritual had proven useless for illegitimate children in the past, even referencing Taehong's own failure to be chosen by any weapon. Taehong, angered by the comment, demanded to know what Cheoljung meant. Cheoljung quickly apologized but added that Taehong's story as an illegitimate child who failed the ritual was well known. Taehong, though furious, forced himself to remain composed. Cheoljung, however, couldn't resist whispering that, in the end, a bastard child would always be a bastard child. He stabbed his wand into the ground and coldly stated that everyone must know their place. Taehong, unable to hold back his anger, warned Cheoljung to restrain himself, as he would not tolerate further insults. But as he spoke, he noticed Cheoljung's expression shift. The elder tightly clenched the railing, stuttering in disbelief. Taehong too turned his attention forward and was shocked by what he saw. Cheoljung muttered in disbelief, asking how such a thing could be possible, while Taehong felt a surge of excitement, though he was equally bewildered. They watched as the bright light from the stone Cheol sat on floated toward the center of the stage, slamming into the array of weapons. Masterworks like the Sanguine Spear, the Iron-Welded Blade, the Divine Sword Mahu, the responsive Dragon Crossbow, and many others began responding to Cheol. The crowd was in an uproar, unable to believe their eyes. Even weapons that already had owners were reacting to Cheol. The light wrapped around the sword Myeongjung was holding, leaving him stunned. Myeongjung excitedly turned to Gunseong, asking if he could believe what was happening and remarking that their youngest brother must possess extraordinary talent. Gunseong simply nodded in agreement. Chaos erupted as the audience struggled to comprehend the situation. Many whispered that an illegitimate child shouldn't be capable of such a feat, yet they all knew the steel selection ritual was infallible. Taishin calmly ordered silence, and the crowd immediately fell quiet. He reminded everyone that, according to clan law, all weapons that chose Cheol rightfully belonged to him. However, given the unprecedented nature of the situation, he invited suggestions on how to proceed. Taehong raised his hand and proposed that, while the clan's laws were clear, granting Cheol all the responding weapons would undermine the ritual's purpose. He suggested allowing Cheol to choose a single weapon instead, ensuring the ritual's integrity for future generations. Taishin considered the suggestion and snapped his fingers, causing the weapons to float in the air. He agreed to Taehong's proposal and lifted Cheol using his power, gently placing him on the floor. Taishin then instructed Cheol to choose the weapon he desired. Cheol, though unsure why this outcome differed from his past life, decided to make the most of the opportunity. He crawled forward, passing by legendary weapons like Franch, the dragon-slaying sword, the holy spear, forged from the body of a saint, White Whale, Valheim, the staff crafted from the world tree where Fae rested, the celestial sword, said to have been forged when the sun, moon, and stars aligned, and many others. Yet, he continued crawling until he reached his destination, confident in his choice. Taishin was stunned when he realized Cheol was reaching for the Black Twilight, a sword discovered by the clan's founder in unexplored lands. Covered in dust and shrouded in mystery, the sword's true power had never been unlocked, and no ancestor had ever been chosen by it. Though classified as a heaven-level weapon, its known abilities did not justify the ranking, and it was stored alongside other heaven-level weapons, more as a symbol of its connection to the founder than its utility. Taishin wondered if Cheol's choice was merely the whim of a child or something more significant. Taishin lifted both Cheol and the Black Twilight, holding the child in one hand and the sword in the other. He smiled, musing whether this could be another will of the skies. With pride, he raised the sword and announced that Cheol had chosen the Black Twilight, marking the end of the ritual. Hwayeon, however, was furious. She saw Kiel as nothing more than a nuisance and resolved that if he ever became an obstacle, she would have no choice but to eliminate him. 9 years later, 9-year-old Kiel informed his maid Gawa that he was heading to his afternoon training. She was surprised and insisted on escorting him, following closely behind. Kiel told her he could go alone, but she disagreed, questioning why he was heading to Zone 1 when the other training areas were empty, and Zone 1 wasn't particularly spacious. He explained that someone was waiting for him there. Suddenly, they heard a scream nearby. Gawa noted that it seemed someone was in Zone 7. They soon saw a young girl panting heavily while being lectured by an instructor. The instructor shouted at her to perform another vertical slice, and she confidently agreed. Kiel recognized the girl as the 8th child, Hua. Gawa, worried, reminded him to address her as his older sister, as he could get into trouble if someone overheard him calling her otherwise. However, Kiel didn't want to call her sister, as they were only 5 months apart. Hua paused to catch her breath, but the instructor barked at her to wield the sword as if it were an extension of her body, emphasizing that she must handle it carefully to avoid injury. Frustrated, Hua threw the sword to the ground in exhaustion and shouted back, demanding to know why the instructor was nagging her so much. She angrily declared that it didn't matter how she held the sword, causing the instructor to panic. He pleaded with her to calm down, explaining that his instructions were for her benefit, and begged her to try again, assuring her she would do better this time. Kiel asked Gawa who the man was, noting that he seemed to have his work cut out for him. Gawa explained that he was Commander Baek Lee-hyun of the Ebony Squad. Kiel was surprised that a commander of such skill was teaching a 9-year-old. Gawa, sensing his reaction, reassured him that a teacher who could truly recognize his talent would appear soon. Kiel, though confused, simply nodded. Gawa then apologized for not being able to look after him as well as she would have liked, blaming her own incompetence. She mentioned how Hua had grown up eating nutrient-rich baby food, implying that Kiel had not been given the same advantages. Kiel, frustrated, asked why she kept bringing this up and reminded her that he was always grateful for everything she had done for him. Her eyes softened at his words. He then told her he didn't want instructors like Lee-hyun, as they were only there because of the Lee clan's influence. He added that he already had some good teachers. A short while later, Kiel arrived at Zone 1, the esteemed Martial Hall, an exclusive training area reserved for the direct line of the Lee clan. He knew Zone 1 was more of a symbolic space, representing the clan's distinguished history rather than a practical training area. However, he had a reason for being there. He stopped in front of a closed storage room and pushed the door open, revealing a collection of older weapons stored inside. Among them, he found a cracked sword leaning against the wall. He picked it up, wondering if he should use it today. After regressing 9 years ago, Kiel experienced several surprising changes. One of the most significant was his newfound ability to read the memories embedded in weapons. Standing in the training hall, he spread his feet, exhaled deeply, closed his eyes, and gathered his inner energy in his chest. When he opened his eyes, he focused on the cracked sword in his hand. Through it, he saw a memory of a man explaining to a group of students that the basics of sword techniques were the same for both advanced and beginner levels. Kiel watched as they demonstrated the correct posture and followed their movements. He had learned that the older and more remarkable the weapon, or the stronger the wielder's attachment to it, the clearer the memories he could see. Thanks to the sword's memories, he successfully executed the first form of the 7-star sword technique, Crimson Wind. He felt a sense of accomplishment, having finally mastered the 7-star sword. Over the past 2 years, he had absorbed the memories of most of the weapons stored in the esteemed Martial Hall. Startled by the sound of clapping behind him, Kiel turned to see Taehong approaching with a wide smile. Taehong, a 4th-rank martial artist and the minister of the Lee clan, was one of the few family members who had genuinely cared for Kiel in both his past life and the present. Though not from the direct line, Taehong's skills were widely respected. Kiel greeted his uncle respectfully, and Taehong patted his head, telling him there was no need to be so formal. Taehong expressed pride in Kiel's dedication to training, noting that he saw him at the training hall every day on his way to and from work. He acknowledged how difficult it must be for Kiel to face discrimination from his siblings, but encouraged him to overcome it. Kiel assured him he was fine, emphasizing that he was still part of the esteemed Lee clan's bloodline. He explained that he had learned the clan's name carried the meaning of "prove yourself with the sword," and he had sworn to do just that with his own strength. Taehong was surprised by his maturity and couldn't help but wonder why someone like Kiel had to be born illegitimate. Taehong reminded Kiel that he was nearing the age for the naming ceremony and offered to be his teacher for the event, even though it was a bit late. He asked Kiel what he thought of the idea and if he was pleased with the offer. Kiel thanked him, but declined, explaining that there was a rule forbidding him from having a teacher before the naming ceremony. He added that he didn't want to put Taehong in a difficult position. Taehong pointed out that Kiel's siblings were blatantly breaking the rules, receiving training from great teachers and consuming nutritious food. Kiel responded that he believed rules shouldn't be broken, even if everyone else was doing so. He reiterated his desire to prove himself with his own strength. Taehong, struck by his resolve, marveled at how mature Kiel seemed for a 9-year-old and noticed that his eyes resembled Taishan's. He admitted that he couldn't change Kiel's mind and patted his head firmly, remarking that he was as stubborn as his father. Taehong expressed concern, saying he couldn't do much if Kiel was set on his decision. but it still bothered him. He then asked if there was anything else Cheol needed. Cheol's face lit up, as he had been waiting for this moment. He told Taehong he had a favor to ask, which excited his uncle. When Taehong asked what it was, Cheol smirked and replied that he wanted to see what was hidden beneath the secret warehouse. The request left Taehong startled. Later, a car arrived in front of a massive gate. A guard signaled for the vehicle to stop and asked the driver, Taehong, to identify himself and state the purpose of his visit. Taehong explained that he was the minister of the Lee clan and was there for a routine inventory check. He introduced Cheol as the youngest member of the Lee clan, adding that he was on a field trip. The guard verified their identities and allowed them to enter. As the gates opened, they drove inside. Cheol knew he needed to act fascinated, so he gazed out the window with an expression of awe. Taehong asked if he was really that excited, to which Cheol replied yes, explaining that he had heard the secret warehouse housed the family's greatest treasures. He smiled to himself, knowing the item he sought was also stored there. The secret warehouse was legendary. It was said to contain weapons of myth, ancient relics whose existence was uncertain, and countless other rare items. People claimed that if something extraordinary existed, it could be found within the Lee clan's secret warehouse. As they entered, Cheol continued to act amazed, looking around with wide eyes. Taehong pressed the elevator button and explained that the basement of the warehouse contained weapons sealed away for various reasons. Cheol excitedly mentioned that he had heard about monster-level weapons that consumed their owners. Taehong agreed, teasing that if Cheol held such a weapon, it might devour both his body and soul. Cheol pretended to be scared. Taehong laughed at his reaction and reassured him that they wouldn't be entering such dangerous areas. He told Cheol to take his time exploring while he handled his business upstairs. Cheol nodded, stepped into the elevator, and waved goodbye to Taehong. When the doors closed, he sighed in relief, realizing how exhausting it was to act like an innocent child. Cheol knew the basement of the secret warehouse, often called the graveyard of weapons, was where countless dangerous and sealed relics were stored. His reason for coming here was to find a specific weapon, Boundless. He recalled that in its normal state, Boundless appeared as a dagger, but when infused with mana, it could change its length, shape, weight, and other properties at will. In his past life, Gunseong, the third child of the Lee clan, had discovered Boundless in this very warehouse. The weapon's overwhelming versatility earned Gunseong the title Ever-Changing, which ultimately led to him becoming the patriarch instead of the eldest sibling, who had been the likeliest candidate. After ascending to power, Gunseong had hunted down Cheol, who was in hiding, and purged him. To prevent history from repeating itself, Cheol knew he had to secure Boundless before Gunseong could find it. Cheol gathered his mana in his palm, preparing to search for the weapon. He knew it would take time, but he was determined to check each relic one by one. As he released his mana, he swore to himself that this time, he would obtain Boundless before Gunseong. An hour later, Cheol examined another dagger, only to find it wasn't Boundless. Frustrated, he sighed. He had spent the last hour checking every dagger-like weapon in the warehouse, but still hadn't found what he was looking for. Refusing to give up, he decided to search again, convinced that Boundless was somewhere in the basement. He guessed he must have missed it during his initial search. As he moved toward a display stand, a rusty dagger suddenly fell off the table and clattered to the floor in front of him. Cheol bent down to pick it up, noting how heavily corroded it was. He wondered how a weapon could deteriorate to such a state. Before he could touch it, his mana surged on its own, lifting the dagger toward him. Shocked, he panicked, stammering as he tried to understand why his mana was acting independently. Before he could react, his mana wrapped around him, pulling him into another realm. Cheol found himself surrounded by piles of bones and scattered weapons. He shouted, demanding to know where he was. He quickly realized this wasn't like the memories he had experienced before. This felt far more vivid, as if he were physically present in this place. Suddenly, a deafening growl echoed behind him. He turned and froze at the sight of an overwhelming presence, a primal monster that seemed to strike fear into nature itself. It was an apocalypse-rank monster, the kind that had once devoured entire civilizations. Trembling in terror, Cheol knew he stood no chance against such a creature. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. As the monster drew closer, his legs gave out, and he collapsed. Just then, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Turning his head, he saw a man holding a bloodied sword. The man dashed forward with incredible speed. He leaped into the air and launched his sword at the apocalypse-rank monster. With a single devastating strike, a technique Cheol recognized as Split Demon, the man cleaved the monster in half, killing it instantly. The monster's body exploded, raining chunks of flesh from the sky. Cheol couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. The man had defeated an apocalypse-rank monster with a single strike. As he looked up, he saw the man standing calmly in front of him. The man turned and asked who Cheol was. Stunned that the man could see him, Cheol hesitated to respond. The man stepped closer, demanding to know why Cheol was there. Without warning, the man raised his sword and swung it down, declaring that this was an act of mercy and that he would send Cheol away painlessly. Cheol braced himself, but before the blade could strike, he woke up. Gasping for breath, Cheol released the rusty dagger he had been clutching. He stared at it, trying to make sense of the vivid scene he had just experienced. The pressure he had felt in that vision still lingered, as if it had been real. Before he could process it further, the rust on the dagger began to melt away. Once the corrosion had completely disappeared, Cheol picked up the now pristine dagger. He slashed his finger with it, letting his blood drip onto the blade. He declared that he would become the master of 10,000 soldiers. The dagger emitted a bright light, signaling its activation. Cheol swung it to the side, and to his amazement, the blade expanded in size. He spun around, testing its movements with a few more slashes. Confident now, he realized he had finally found Boundless. Days later, Cheol was in Zone 1's training hall, attempting to replicate a technique, but it ended in yet another failure. It had been a week since he obtained Boundless, the weapon he had discovered in the underground secret warehouse. To keep it hidden, he had transformed Boundless into a ring. As he practiced, he recalled the technique he had witnessed in the vision. The Split Demon. The man who had demonstrated it had only shown him the technique and mentioned its name, likely because he believed Cheol wasn't ready to learn it yet. Cheol knew that, beyond the sheer power of the technique, the man's movements had been incredibly graceful, something he couldn't replicate no matter how hard he tried. Smiling, he raised his sword and swung it backward, reminding himself that he wasn't in a rush. He spread his legs, recalling how, before his regression, he had been an outcast who couldn't even inherit the family's basic techniques. This was his first time experiencing such advanced martial arts, and he felt determined to master it. He assured himself that he could do it, as he remembered the man's movements clearly. However, he suddenly stopped, realizing a critical flaw. He was a 9-year-old child, not an adult. Trying to mimic an adult's movements would never be efficient. He realized he needed to adapt the technique to suit his own body, slowly and naturally. Relaxing, Cheol closed his eyes and adjusted his stance. He wielded the sword in a way that felt natural for his smaller frame and swung it down with force, causing the floor to crack. Pulling the sword out of the ground, he felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing he was starting to get the hang of the split demon technique. However, he still needed to solve the issue of mana utilization. No matter how many times he tried to replicate the mana flow he had witnessed, he always failed, as if he were forgetting something crucial. Frustrated, he sighed and decided to keep practicing, unaware that someone was silently watching him from the shadows. As he prepared to practice again, a figure with long hair rushed toward him from behind and grabbed his sword. Startled, Cheol turned to see a woman demanding to know where he had learned the technique he was practicing. He noticed her dark hair and brown eyes, clear signs that she was a direct descendant of the esteemed Lee clan. Confused, he asked who she was, which seemed to surprise her. She wondered aloud how he didn't recognize her, then guessed it might be because she rarely left her quarters. She introduced herself as Lee Gyongha, shaking his hand with such enthusiasm that it caused him to spin around. Cheol realized she was his youngest aunt and remembered Taehong mentioning in his past life that Gyongha was different from others and that Taishin had disliked her. The realization made his stomach churn, and he suddenly felt dizzy, collapsing to the ground. She remarked that he seemed rather fragile, making him wonder why she didn't consider the possibility that she was simply unnaturally strong. She approached him and asked where he had learned the technique he had been practicing. He countered by asking why she wanted to know. She explained that what he had used was an ancient martial art, and she had a deep fascination with old martial arts, which was why she was curious. She pulled a book from her pocket, mentioning that ancient monsters had lived long ago as well, and handed it to him as a gift. Cheol accepted it and opened it as she instructed. He noticed the handwriting was difficult to read, but he could tell it contained information about mana techniques and martial arts. The content seemed advanced, making it hard for him to fully grasp. This led him to question the rumors about Gyongha, realizing they might not be entirely true. He stopped at one page and asked her what it was about. Excited, she leaned over to look and explained that it described old mana techniques based on mana paths rather than mana circles. She added that in the past, mana techniques relied solely on mana paths, unlike modern techniques that stored mana in the heart. She questioned whether it was fair to dismiss the old techniques as outdated. Cheol was surprised by her perspective, as he had never considered it before. She went on to explain that she believed the ancient mana techniques were superior to modern ones, which was why so few records of them remained. She had been researching amplification and transformation techniques for years. Hearing her explanation, Cheol realized that the technique described in the book was similar to the one used by the man in his vision, Boundless's mana technique. He handed the book back to Gyongha and walked to the center of the training hall, telling her to wait a moment. Confused, she asked what he was doing. Cheol picked up his sword and began spreading his mana from the mana circle throughout his body. He then rejected the mana's attempt to return to the mana circle, focusing solely on utilizing the mana paths. When he opened his eyes, he knew he had finally understood the mana utilization technique the man had used. Confident, he lifted his sword and swung it down, slashing the ground in front of him in a perfect, clean line. The force of the strike shattered the ground, leaving both Cheol and Gyongha stunned. Cheol was thrilled that he had succeeded, but Gyongha rushed over and grabbed him, demanding to know if it was an amplification technique. He confirmed it, and she pressed him for details on how he had done it. He simply replied that he had figured it out, which she accepted but still asked how. He countered by asking why he had to tell her. She shouted that he had used the notebook she gave him to understand it, and that notebook contained everything she had studied. She then calmly explained that she had spent over 10 years searching for a way to use the technique, even after being kicked out of the clan. She asked what she needed to do for him to share his knowledge. Keel hesitated for a moment before telling her she would need to promise him 3 things. She asked what they were, and he explained the first. She must not talk to others about him unless he gave her permission, even if it was his eldest brother or father. Confused, she asked why. He explained that he disliked the idea of people discussing him, to which she agreed, noting that she felt the same way. Her expression turned sad as she spoke. Keel continued, stating that the second condition was that she must never lie to him, as they needed to trust each other. He promised to be truthful with her as well. Though frustrated, she agreed, and asked what the final condition was. 1 year later, Cheel was in the training ground when Gawa rushed toward him in a panic, clutching a letter. Gyeongha, who was nearby, looked at Gawa curiously as Cheel asked what had brought her there. Gawa, out of breath, handed him the letter and urged him to read it. Gyeongha, equally confused, asked what it was. Cheel opened the envelope and found a summons order for the naming ceremony, scheduled for the 10th of September at the Central Training Hall. The letter was signed by Myungjung as a proxy, making Cheel wonder if Taishin was away. He hadn't heard about any expeditions or absences, but before he could dwell on it, he noticed Gyeongha trembling beside him. Gyeongha furiously demanded to know why the naming ceremony summons had arrived now. Cheel asked her what was wrong, and she explained that she had finally started to grasp their research and needed his guidance more than ever. She shouted that if he attended the naming ceremony, he would have to stay for a while, leaving her without his help. She begged him not to go, but Cheel remained silent, watching as his aunt threw a tantrum. Over the past year, Cheel and Gyeongha had been deeply immersed in researching mana techniques. They had studied modern mana techniques, which used the mana circle as the core, and ancient mana techniques, which relied on the mana paths. They had also explored a new type of mana technique that combined the two. Gyeongha had shared that successfully merging modern and ancient techniques was her dream. Thanks to their year of research, Cheel had discovered that accumulating mana, transforming its traits in the mana circle, and using the mana paths to control and utilize it allowed him to wield mana far more efficiently than others his age. Gyeongha, still upset, stuttered as she asked if he really had to go and if he couldn't skip the ceremony, arguing that their research was more important. Cheel calmly replied that she knew he had no choice but to attend. Her disappointment deepened, but he assured her that it wouldn't take long and that he intended to continue their work. Gyeongha, confused, asked how he planned to balance the demanding lessons of the naming ceremony with their research. Cheel smirked and explained that he would proceed with both the mana technique training and the recovery of ancient techniques simultaneously. Later, Cheel entered the training tube alongside Hwa. The instructor informed them that their training for the day would involve enduring magic attacks for 30 minutes. Jang Wook, the Blood Tiger Squad's group leader and instructor, observed Cheel closely. He noticed something unusual. Cheel was deflecting every attack, even though Wook had expected him to fail immediately, given that Cheel had never received basic training. Wook realized that Cheel was using advanced mana techniques to deflect the attacks. As he watched, he noticed the intensity in Cheel's eyes and realized that Cheel was testing himself, comparing his skills to Hwa's to gauge his own level. Wook also observed that Cheel was subtly pushing for higher-level lessons, despite being only 10 years old and an illegitimate child. Wook questioned whether it was fair to label Cheel as just an illegitimate child, given his evident talent. Feeling a pang of guilt, Wook clenched his fist and vowed to reflect on his past behavior. He resolved to teach Cheel everything he could, going beyond the standard lessons for the naming ceremony. 30 minutes later, the training ended. Cheel stretched his body, thinking how insane it was for the Lee clan to subject children to a device that constantly activated magic attacks to build resistance. As he moved his shoulders, he noticed a change in Wook's tone toward him, though he didn't expect an apology. Deciding not to dwell on it, Cheel began walking to rest, unaware that someone was hiding nearby. Suddenly, Hwa lunged at him, but he blocked her attack effortlessly. Hwa called him a bastard and demanded they talk. Cheel pushed her hand away and asked what she was trying to do. Hwa warned him to watch his mouth, reminding him that she was a legitimate child while he was not. Cheel simply turned around, not wanting to deal with Hwa, and told her he didn't have time to talk. His dismissive attitude shocked and angered her. In a fit of rage, she launched her fist at him, shouting for him not to ignore her. Cheel was startled to see her using mana and frustrated that she wouldn't leave him alone when he just wanted to walk away. He dodged her attack and grabbed her collar with swift precision, holding it tightly and making her tremble in pain. He told her that if she wanted to whine and cry, she should do so in her mother's arms, as he was too busy to deal with her. He released her and turned to leave but paused when she shouted that everything was his fault. She blamed him for the constant comparisons she faced since the steel selection ritual, where his performance had overshadowed hers. She screamed at him to disappear like any other illegitimate child, claiming it wasn't fair that she couldn't sleep, had no time for snacks, and was always training, while he seemed to excel effortlessly. She was about to say more but stopped herself, realizing she had almost revealed too much about her mother's demands. Cheel calmly told her it must be convenient to blame others for her struggles. He reminded her that, as a so-called bastard child, he didn't have the luxury of making excuses. He added that if she couldn't sleep, she should stay awake. If she couldn't catch up to him even by skipping snacks, she should stop eating altogether. and if she resented him, she should do whatever it took to surpass him. He concluded that if she ever managed to surpass him, he would apologize, as that was how their family operated. Hua clenched her fists, calling him an arrogant bastard, and vowed to outperform him at the naming ceremony. She swore she would make him beg for forgiveness and warned him not to forget it. Chiol quietly walked away with a smile but stopped to look back at her, telling her he would look forward to it. A moment later, in the Zone 7 training hall, Hua was training intensely. Her handmaid noticed someone approaching and greeted Huayan, the matriarch of the Li clan. Huayan ordered the maid to leave, as she needed to speak with her daughter. The maid complied, and Huayan entered the training hall, where Hua was pushing herself to her limits. Huayan asked what Hua was doing, and Hua, startled, stammered that she was training. Huayan reminded her that she had heard about her recent loss and expressed disappointment, saying she had expected Hua to crush her rivals. She added that if Hua was only training to avoid being lectured, she might as well quit, as she didn't even feel like lecturing her anymore. Hua explained that she wasn't training because of her mother's expectations, but because she wanted to. She declared that she would surpass Kiel no matter what, not because she was told to, but because she was determined to do so on her own. Huayan, visibly angered, asked if Hua was saying she was motivated by a bastard child. Hua tried to explain but couldn't find the words. Huayan reminded her that, as a legitimate child of the Li clan, her standing was fundamentally different from Chiol's. Surpassing him should have been a given, yet here she was, being driven by him. Huayan then handed Hua a small bottle, explaining that it contained a lethal poison called dreamlike trance. She placed it in Hua's hand and walked past her, coldly stating that if Hua couldn't surpass Kiel, she should trample him instead, as that was their family's way. Without another word, Huayan left. The next day, in Chiol's palace, Gawa stared at the computer screen, stuttering in disbelief. She checked his 14th report card again, which showed all ranks at the top. Kiel asked her what she thought and if she was finally free of worries. Overwhelmed, Gawa hugged him tightly, saying she hadn't done much for him, yet he had achieved so much. Chiol hugged her back and told her not to say such things. Suddenly, they both froze when they heard a loud noise outside. Gyeongha burst into the room excitedly, shouting that it was time to train. Chiol replied that he had just finished training, but Gyeongha insisted they had to go, claiming that training in mana arts would help relieve his fatigue. Chiol pointed out that he had never heard of such an effect, causing Gyeongha to stutter and look around nervously as she insisted it was true. Sighing, Chiol told her he had something to show her. He revealed his progress, shocking her when she realized he had attained his first star. Mana arts training typically involved 3 stages. The Iron Body stage, where practitioners strengthened their bodies, the Qigong stage, where they altered the nature of their mana, and the Extraordinary Ability stage, where they demonstrated supernatural abilities through mana. However, Gyeongha's mana arts were different. Even at the same stage, practitioners could exhibit unique abilities, which was why her system was divided into stages of stars rather than the traditional progression. Gyeongha examined Chiol to confirm his achievement and praised him for reaching 1 star. She asked if it had been awkward learning to use his mana paths, admitting she had thought it would take him another year. Chiol explained that he had learned to use them during his lessons, though the training had been grueling. He mentioned that he had struggled with mana control and that the balance between his mana circle and mana paths had nearly shattered. He realized that mana flows naturally like water and that the body itself acts as a vessel for mana. Gyeongha looked at her hand and told him she believed she could achieve the same, though it might take time. Chiol felt relieved that she had finally grasped the concept. Gyeongha hugged him tightly, thanking him for his guidance. Chiol screamed in pain, telling her she was breaking his ribs. She let him go and confidently declared that they should aim for 2 stars next. Chiol, lying on the ground in pain, thought he might die from her enthusiasm. Gyeongha explained that what he had achieved was 1 star and asked if he understood how it differed from the traditional first stage. He confirmed he did. She then asked what he thought his greatest strength was. Before he could answer, she interrupted, saying she didn't think he was right. Startled, Chiol insisted she had never seen him in swordsmanship training. Gyeongha admitted she had watched him a few times out of boredom, but clarified that she believed his greatest ability was his talent for mana arts. She explained that his skill in mana arts was so extraordinary that it overshadowed everything else, including his swordsmanship. She added that no one had ever been able to follow her mana arts teachings before, which confused Chiol, as he had been ridiculed in his past life for his inability to use mana. Gyeongha concluded that attaining 2 stars wouldn't be difficult for him, and that if he succeeded, the naming ceremony would be a piece of cake. Gyeongha excitedly told Chiol that from then on, she would teach him proper techniques, and he needed to focus. Chiol agreed and stood up, asking Gyeongha what was beside her. She glanced at the box next to her and touched it, then suddenly threw something at him. The object grazed his face and destroyed the wall behind him. Gyeongha smiled and explained that they were metal marbles. She emphasized that he needed to learn to move while releasing mana, as using mana arts while stationary was no different from dead mana arts. She grabbed a handful of marbles and asked if they should begin the training, leaving Chiol slightly worried. The next day, in the training hall, Chiol and Hua stood facing a man who introduced himself as Li Zhongquan, the leader of the Blood Tiger Squad. Zhongquan informed them that he would be teaching them the esteemed Li clan's secret techniques. He instructed them to choose the weapons they used and return within 1 minute, warning them not to dawdle. Both Chiol and Hua agreed and rushed off. Hua glanced at Chiol worriedly, which annoyed him. He asked her what she was staring at and if she had something to say. Startled, Hua denied staring and claimed she had nothing to say. She then whispered, asking if he used a sword. Chiol replied no, and grabbed several weapons instead. Hua was confused, pointing out that he always used a sword during weapons training, but Chiol ignored her and walked back to the stage. Zhongquan noticed Chiol holding multiple weapons and asked what he was doing. Chiol explained that Zhongquan had told them to choose a weapon and return, so he had followed the instruction. Zhongquan reminded him that he had asked for the weapon they used, but Chiol insisted that the weapons he held were the ones he used. Zhongquan was left speechless and muttered that he had thought Chiol wasn't dumb, but now realized he was a complete idiot. As Zhongquan walked a short distance away, he picked up a spear and told them to pay close attention to what he was about to say. He clarified that while he had promised to teach them the clan's secret techniques, he wouldn't be teaching them postures or skills. Instead, he explained that the Li clan's secret arts, known as enlightenment, required a strong foundation and the awakening of the sixth sense dormant in their blood. Zhongquan warned them not to struggle too much when awakening their sixth sense. Hua, worried, asked what Zhongquan was going to do. Chiol told her to prepare herself if she didn't want to be knocked unconscious immediately. Before they could react, Zhongquan appeared beside Chiol in an instant. Shocked, Chiol barely managed to deflect Zhongquan's spear strike, though the force pushed him back. Zhongquan was impressed that Chiol had blocked the attack. Chiol landed safely on the ground, cursing under his breath that he had to go through this crazy training again. He stood up, positioning his feet firmly, determined to approach this training differently than in his past life. With a focused expression, he dashed toward Zhongquan, vowing that this time things would be different. Weeks passed, but Chiol continued to be outmatched by Zhongquan. During one session, Hua dashed from behind to attack, but before she could get close, Zhongquan spun his spear and struck her back, sending her crashing to the floor. It had been a month since they began training with Zhongquan, and the intensity of the sessions left them with broken bones and internal injuries. Chiol knew this wasn't the kind of training suitable for 10-year-olds, but he refused to complain. He was starting to get the hang of it, and that was enough motivation to keep going. Later, Hua woke up screaming and asked if she had passed out again. Chiol confirmed it was her 22nd time, adding that he had only passed out 16 times. Frustrated, he shouted that she wouldn't pass out if she were better prepared. Zhongquan observed them, noting that Hua had an incredibly sturdy body. Despite his heart attacks, she had never sustained serious injuries. Zhongquan also realized that Chiol was something special. Initially, he had thought Chiol was foolish for bringing an armful of weapons, but he now saw that Chiol was proficient with all of them, utilizing each one effectively. Zhongquan smiled, intrigued by Chiol's progress over the past month. He ordered them to resume training and return to their positions. Hours later, both Chiol and Hua were exhausted. Chiol called out to Hua, and she asked what he wanted. He told her he would give her a signal and asked her to block Zhongquan just once for him. Hua questioned why she should help him, and Chiol replied that she didn't have to if she didn't want to, but he thought they could land a solid attack together. Hua hesitated but eventually asked if he was sure about the plan. Chiol confidently confirmed. Hua then dashed toward Zhongquan, shouting that he would pay for his earlier strike. Chiol followed, knowing that at his current skill level, he stood no chance of winning alone. Their only advantage was their numbers. Zhongquan acknowledged their teamwork, spinning his spear as he prepared to counter. Chiol stabbed at Zhongquan's head, but Zhongquan easily dodged and deflected the attack. This was part of Chiol's plan. Impressed by Chiol's skill, Zhongquan dashed toward him. Chiol swung his spear and shouted for Hua to act. Hua appeared from above, swinging her sword at Zhongquan. While Zhongquan was distracted, Chiol threw his spear aside and grabbed a nearby sword, infusing it with his mana. He knew the only way to land a proper attack was to use the ultimate technique he had learned from Boundless. Lifting his feet off the ground, he dashed forward, executing the split demon technique. Zhongquan was shocked by Chiol's sudden attack. As Chiol closed in, he released his sword and aimed a punch at Zhongquan's head, believing it would work. He struck with all his might, feeling a surge of pride, but Zhongquan still managed to block it. With a forceful motion, Zhongquan dragged Chiol forward and hurled him into a wall. The impact caused Chiol to cough up blood and scream in pain. Zhongquan congratulated Chiol on awakening his sixth sense after 37 days of training. He then effortlessly dodged Hua's sneak attack, telling her she still had a long way to go. Hua landed next to Chiol and collapsed as well. Zhongquan walked away with a smile, announcing that their training for the day was over. A few minutes later, both Chiol and Hua woke up. Hua angrily demanded to know what had gone wrong with his plan, shouting that she had trusted him. Meanwhile, Zhongquan examined his palm, noticing a small injury. He realized Chiol had managed to land a hit despite Zhongquan's use of mana, something he had vowed not to do during their training. Zhongquan acknowledged that Chiol had the ability to judge when to abandon an attack and possessed excellent combat sense. He knew this would make the elders of the household wary of Cheol in the future. Hua awakened her sixth sense on the 47th day, and both she and Cheol graduated from Jungkwan's lessons. Cheol used his remaining time to rest and review what he had learned. During this period, his eldest brother, Lee Myungjung, visited him. Myungjung, known as the Twin Star, was nearly a 2-end rank magician and a 2-end rank martial artist. While others admired and feared him, Cheol saw Myungjung as his one true brother. Myungjung apologized for not being able to pay much attention to Cheol lately due to his busy schedule. Cheol assured him it was fine. Myungjung noted that it was their first meeting, yet Cheol recognized him immediately. Cheol confirmed this, explaining that even though they were half-brothers, he couldn't possibly not know the face of his eldest brother. Myungjung gently corrected him, saying they might have different mothers, but Cheol was as much his brother as any of their siblings. He thought to himself that Cheol, despite not having gone through his naming ceremony, seemed unusually harsh on himself. Cheol apologized, but Myungjung told him there was no need and that he didn't have to be so formal, as they were brothers. Cheol warmly agreed, realizing that Myungjung had always been kind, even in his younger years. Myungjung then pulled something from his pocket, explaining it was a gift to commemorate their first meeting. He had received it when he was admitted to France's Eiffel Magic University, but believed Cheol would find more use for it. He handed Cheol a potion called Nectar, the Wine of the Gods, a high-tier miracle medicine produced in limited quantities, only 500 milliliters per year, in France's Magic Tower. Cheol accepted it and thanked Myungjung, surprising him. Myungjung remarked that Cheol was different from their other siblings, who often saw him as a rival. He expressed relief that Cheol didn't view him that way, though he was used to such dynamics. Cheol, however, clarified that Myungjung was mistaken. He explained that he did see Myungjung as a rival because he too was a member of the Lee clan. He added brightly that no one knew if he might grow up to be Myungjung's greatest rival, but he hoped it would be a healthy competition. Myungjung laughed heartily at this, patting Cheol's head and saying he looked forward to the day Cheol became his biggest rival. Cheol confidently agreed, silently swearing to protect his older brother, who genuinely cared for him, in this life. A few days later, the day of the second trial of the esteemed Lee clan's naming ceremony arrived. Cheol and the others were taken to Red and Blue Island, a unique landmass where the terrain's color shifted based on the mana concentration in the atmosphere. This island had served as the site for the clan's naming ceremonies since ancient times. Their guide explained that they would need to survive on the island for 3 weeks to prove themselves. He handed them devices to track their locations, instructing them to keep the devices on at all times. After they put on the devices, the guide added that the trial chamber would remain open for 2 days following the 3-week period. Once the instructions were complete, they disembarked from the boat, and the guide wished them luck before departing. Hua told Cheol she had something to say, but he interrupted, noting that she had finally made up her mind. Confused, she asked how he knew she had been trying to say something to him since their training began. Cheol simply stared at her, wondering how he could have missed her obvious behavior. He told her to go ahead and say what was on her mind, promising to at least listen. Hua hesitated but eventually removed her pendant and set it aside, gesturing for Cheol to do the same. He complied, and once both pendants were removed, he asked what she wanted to tell him. Hua pulled out a small vial from her pocket and explained that it contained a poison called dreamlike trance. She revealed that the poison was only effective against children under the age of 15 and would evaporate if exposed to air for more than 5 minutes. However, if ingested, it would cause long-term malfunctions in the victim's mana paths. Cheol asked seriously who had given it to her, but she refused to answer. Instead, she threw the vial onto a rock, causing it to evaporate, and declared that there was no evidence left. She shouted that she would beat him fair and square, without resorting to such underhanded methods, and demanded that he take the trial seriously and give it his all. Cheol was initially stunned, but then smiled, assuring her that he had always planned to do his best, regardless of her actions. Hua praised his determination. She then asked if he was fully equipped, and advised him to challenge the center of the island only after he had acclimated to the environment, as she had heard it was extremely dangerous. Cheol replied that he was aware of the risks and teased her, asking if she was worried about him. Hua shouted that she wasn't worried about him, but was concerned he might die before they could settle their rivalry. Suddenly, a loud growl echoed from the forest ahead, startling both of them. They exchanged a glance, knowing the growl came from deep within the woods. Hua told Cheol not to die and began walking away. As she disappeared into the distance, Cheol felt a pang of guilt, knowing his destination wasn't the outskirts of the island. He clenched his fist, encouraging himself, and set off confidently toward the center of the island, ready to face whatever challenges awaited him. Meanwhile, in the surveillance room, members of the Lee clan were watching Hua on the screen. As expected, she had already completed her first assignment, hunting. They noted that the number of animals she had defeated was impressive, especially for her first practical experience. Cheoljung remarked that this was only natural, given that Huayon was her mother, and there was no way Hua would underperform. He asked if it had been 47 days since the training began, and Jungkwan confirmed, adding that Hua hadn't originally been at this level. It had been expected that she would take 2 full months to reach this point. Jungkwon acknowledged that Hua had decent talent but emphasized that her rapid improvement was largely due to Cheol's influence, as he had provoked her to push herself harder. Cheoljung then asked what Cheol was doing. Jungkwon guessed that Cheol was likely searching for a place to set up a hideout. Cheoljung criticized Cheol, calling him a coward who chose to hide and run away like a rat. Others joined in, mocking Cheol and expressing embarrassment that he was an offspring of the Lee clan. Myungjung intervened, ordering them to stop. He explained that finding a hideout in a dangerous environment was a strategic move, not something to ridicule. The others reluctantly agreed, admitting that their expectations had been set high by Hwa's performance. However, Cheoljung reminded everyone that being average in the esteemed Lee clan was unacceptable, and the others nodded, agreeing that mediocrity was laughable for someone of their lineage. Myungjung clenched his fists in anger, disgusted that they were mocking a child simply because of his background. He wondered when their clan had fallen so low, but realized it had always been this way. Myungjung turned his attention back to the screen, watching Cheol and wondering what he was thinking as he headed toward the center of the island. Myungjung glanced to his side when he heard a noise and noticed Taehong nervously biting his nails. Seeing Taehong's concern, Myungjung realized he wasn't the only one worried about Cheol. He couldn't help but wonder what Cheol was planning. Back on the island, Cheol finally found a suitable spot. He set up camp, started a fire, burned medicinal herbs, and blocked the entrance with leaves. The clan members watching the screen were impressed by his concealment skills, but Cheoljung was shocked when Cheol removed his tracking device and hid it under the leaves. The signal from Cheol's device disappeared, leaving everyone in the surveillance room stunned. Jungkwon burst out laughing, unable to contain his amusement, and shouted that Cheol was as unpredictable as ever. Myungjung and Taehong, however, slapped their foreheads in a mix of worry and frustration. Cheol looked at the hidden devices, thinking there was no reason to let the clan monitor his every move. Now that he was free from surveillance, he could use Boundless without restraint. He activated Boundless, transforming it back into a dagger. Deciding to make the most of his time on the island, he resolved to gather as many resources as possible. However, his attention was drawn to the purple tea he had brewed. It was nearly ready, but its grotesque appearance made him question whether he could bring himself to drink it. No one in their right mind would believe it was made from mana herbs. Mixing the tea in disgust, Cheol reminded himself that in his previous life, he hadn't even had enough money to buy a cheap elixir. At least now, thanks to his time following a druggist, he knew how to make this concoction. He recalled Gyeongha's advice that the red and blue island was rich in mana, making it the perfect place to increase his total mana through mana arts. He guessed that drinking the tea, despite its revolting taste, would likely enhance its effectiveness. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Cheol lifted the bowl and forced himself to drink the tea, fighting the urge to vomit. After finishing it, he threw the empty bowl to the ground, overwhelmed by the hellish taste. With that, Cheol's lonely 3-week struggle on the island began.